An SABC News presentation.
Good evening to you. A warm welcome to Interface. My name is Thembi Samachele. Well, 25.3 million South Africans have registered to vote. The IEC says 79.89% of registered voters are under the age of 30. However, violence and intimidation marred registration, with several stations unable to operate. The violence was linked to service delivery protests, with residents expressing their anger and their frustration. Some are adamant that they will not vote. Government and political parties have called on the public to use their democratic right to vote instead of staying away from the polls. Well, how can we address voter apathy? And will the elections be free and fair, given the unrest in some quarters? Our guests tonight are Professor Susan Boyson, who is with Western University, and Aisha Kaji, who is from the Right to Know campaign and is also an independent analyst. And as usual, you can join the conversation by commenting on our Facebook page. It's Interface on SABC3, or on Twitter at Thembi Samachele. Well, welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, elections in full swing, election mode at least in full swing. We're seeing all sorts of interesting things. But I just want to know, Prof, how are you reading the mood in the country at the moment?
The mood is angry, but it's also deliberately angry. This is pre-election time. And voters, even if they could largely, and the research indicates that they would largely, retain incumbent party with roughly a kind of percentages, maybe a bit less than we've seen before, they want to demonstrate, in a way, show that they are not happy, that they want more, even if their lives have changed quite substantially, but it is unequal. They always see many people better off than they are. They know they do not see their elected representatives very frequently. So for South Africans, and I saw that in recent research that I did, they see protests as an inherent part of the representative mechanism. It's a time when high politicians come to visit, when they may even listen. If the communities extract a few promises from high-level visitors, they escalate their chances of delivery post-election quite substantially. So it's a very rational repertoire that South African voters have developed.
I like the word you use. Do you agree, Aisha? I mean,
yes,
particularly
to some extent.
with the aspect of, you know, we're going to grab the headlines, some politician is going to come here, and we're likely to get our problem solved.
Yes, I think there's a deliberation about the timing of some of these protests at any rate. But there's also, I think, an upsurge generally in the levels of frustration around service delivery issues, around gross corruption issues, and around issues of gross inequality, you know, where many people who feel that they gave up so much in the fight for our freedom have not tasted to their minds the fruits of our freedom, and then also for them to see that huge gap between those who are conspicuously consumptive, you know, those who drive fancy cars have the ultra haves, as you put it very nicely. Those who have mansions, live in mansions, you know, flash all kinds of symbols of wealth. When so many of their fellow South Africans are living not just below the poverty line, but without really basic services such as clean water and, you know, proper sanitation.
But what's really happening here? I mean, I was reading somewhere that we're now seeing about 32 protests a day. And for me, that kind of says that's a lot of protests. But the question is it any different to what we saw in previous elections? 20 years down the line, has there really been an increase in the number of protests that we see?
We see continuous increase in the level of protests in South Africa. As people feel they are not gaining sufficiently from this democracy, they activate this alternative stream of democracy, direct action and protest, in order to strengthen the electoral mechanism. So they bring that in. And I think it's something that's slightly different this time around, apart from the higher frequencies, is also, I think we see an level of higher anger, greater frustration. We must remember that we've had significant levels of unemployment for quite a period of time. And very often young people really fear that they're never going to escape life in the residential areas, townships, where they feel they are trapped. And people are available to protest. It was very interesting in the 2011 local government elections. We saw that first time that people didn't step back with their protests in quite a few of the communities on election day. Previous elections, it was election day, no more protests. Local elections 2011, protests and elections. But people then did not interfere with those ones who did want to go and vote. And that will be very interesting to watch this time if we see analogous to the protests last weekend in voter registration, where it was stopped in some cases, whether there may be interference with the voting process as well.
Prof, looking at the increase that you're talking about then in these service delivery protests, are the politicians listening? Are they paying attention to what the people are saying? Or are we seeing the same kind of
I wish I could unambiguously say yes, they do. They've also become mischievous. They know by now, that we understand South African politics, many people who protest will still go and vote ANC even after they have protested. Unfortunately, politicians know that. And they have, even after some high-level visits in the last weekend at registration, and the week before that, premiers suddenly perched where they haven't been for years in communities. So it works for people in that way. But we also have heard people in the ANC, senior people, say we mustn't make too much out of it because this is just a form of negotiating, bargaining for votes.
Well, Aisha, just on that then, bearing in mind what the IEC has just said, that 80% of eligible voters have now registered to vote. This whole idea that South Africans are apathetic, we're not voting, and people are saying we're not going to vote, that's not really then a true reflection of what's likely to happen.
If it's true that 80% of eligible voters have registered, then that's not true, obviously, that there's a level of apathy. However, I have seen amongst students, and I'm pretty sure Susan has as well, amongst young people, there is far less interest in the political process and the voting process than I would have hoped for as a political analyst. And also there's a sense of almost of resignation that because the incumbent party is such a juggernaut, that because the party is still the party that most people will probably vote for, even though they're protesting now, because they see no viable alternative, there's a sense of resignation, particularly amongst young people, that things aren't going to change anytime soon unless they actually get active in other ways. And I think the protests that we're seeing are one of those other ways. And in fact, I think it's healthy for our democracy that people exercise their right to protest. It is a constitutional right. But when that right then violates the rights of others, that's when it becomes a problem.
So when they start burning the libraries and
or
those
preventing
kind of
others from registering or voting, etc.
Not sure about that one, Aisha. Do you agree, Prof, before we go to break?
It can be constructive. It keeps people engaged in politics, but it can be a big blow up once they feel even that alternative stream of political participation does not work for them, because that is not systematically and gradually being channeled into formal politics.
Okay.
So it's volatile.
Look, I would love to get your thoughts on this. What do you think? The service delivery protests that we're seeing, are they really healthy for our democracy? Do you agree with our analysts in studio? Well, give us your thoughts. Interface on SABC3. That's how you find us on Facebook and also on Twitter at Tembisa Magele. We're back after the short break. Welcome back. You're watching Interface, and let's just run through some of those numbers again. We're receiving word that the IEC had aimed to get 80% of eligible voters to register, and we don't have the figure yet of how many they were actually able to get, but they have said that around 79.89% of registered voters are under the age of 30. Now, we're still going to verify those numbers, but is that a likely scenario?
Well, it depends on how many how many of the eligible voters are actually under the age of 30.
Yeah.
I think that would be
Yeah.
an interesting statistic to get, firstly, what the pool is, and then to say, well, is that realistic that almost 80% of those under the age of 30 who could register have registered?
Because that would indicate that the born-frees are actually going out there and registering to
And
vote.
are less apathetic than we think
they are.
Yes.
Prof?
I would love to see a confirmation of the statistics, because previous figures that I'd seen was that the number of under 30s actually are high but very, very low in registration still. So if that was what was affected in the last weekend, that would have been a major turnaround, almost unbelievable turnaround, but amazing if it was true, because that would indicate that young people are prepared to at least keep their options open, as the IEC was saying in their campaign. Register now, decide whether you vote later. And that would have been very significant if those figures are real.
Let's get back to the elections then. Definitely an interesting time. It's going to be a very interesting election. But there's talk about this being a time of alignment of the political landscape, that, you know, the opposition versus the ruling party. There's so many changes with what's happening with COSATU, with the EFF joining the fray, and you know, the troubles with the DA and Ahang, that, you know, there's some alignment happening politically. Is that really the case?
I think it would be interesting and encouraging if that were the case. But I think that many of the smaller parties and the newer parties within the political landscape right now are not ready yet for coalition politics. We're still in a phase of our democratization process where coalitions are not by any means mature coalitions. If they were to work effectively, say a coalition were to win a province of this country, okay, it would need to be a coalition that had set the ground rules very clearly long before the campaign phase of the electoral cycle began. We're already in that campaign phase now. The election date's been set. It's very late in the political game to be thinking of pre-election coalitions. And for those to work effectively, as I said, they need to have a clear plan of what they intend to do post-election and where their synergies and points of similarity are. What are their lowest common denominators, if you will? And I think that many of our political parties have not thought that through clearly enough.
Prof, do any of our opposition political parties really have that common denominator that is really strong enough to get them to form a coalition?
You know, perhaps there are similarities ideologically. There's clear definitions, dividing lines, left of the ANC or right of the ANC. And recently, we saw an attempt, both significant, definitely to the right of the ANC. That did not work. Personality factors come into it as well. Our electoral system is very important in this whole matter. In a PR electoral system, there are really no wasted votes. And most of the political parties can go in and can get their minimal percentages on 0.25%, a quarter of a percent. You can get one of the national vote. You can get roughly that, one representative in parliament. And they can always come and cooperate later. So it's really, in some ways, I think it's to find extra publicity that people are trying to come together or say they are trying to come together at this stage. It really does not make sense. And I don't think it will make an impact if a group of 5 parties suddenly come together.
Okay.
So no real difference.
And the ructions that we're hearing within COSATU, you know, that NUMSA is likely not to support the ruling party, is that really something that should be of concern?
I think that is a major different factor that enters the political landscape, electoral landscape this time around. It is significant for the ANC to get those kinds of helpers around in organized formations to come and help on the campaign. So, and psychologically it's very important too. It shows on a high level that there are forms of discontent with the ANC. And very importantly, that comes at the exact same time that the traditional ANC Youth League is just not in place anymore. And they, in previous elections, had played a significant role. So this is a different landscape for the ANC.
What I thought was interesting, though, was the Secretary General of the ANC saying, even though and NUMSA has said they're not going to formally support the ANC. They have not said they will stop individual members from voting for the ANC.
Absolutely, and I think that shows that, you know, even within NUMSA, within COSATU, there is still a strong respect for a democratic tradition. So you can't actually force people to stay away from something that you have distanced yourself from as an organization. If individual members want to exercise their right to vote, that is their democratic right. And I think that's again, it's healthy for our democracy. In fact, dare I say it, I think that the fractures we're seeing within the tripartite alliance are in and of themselves healthy for our democracy in the long term.
You have got to explain that one. Why would they be healthy?
Because if you have the level of dissatisfaction and frustration that we've seen on the ground in communities that have led to the protests we began this segment talking about, then it is encouraging to see that even at leadership level, where some members of an alliance do not agree with the majority, that they are able to exercise that right to disagree and to distance themselves from that. That's a healthy democracy
so this is
in action.
democracy in action, Prof?
In many ways, yes. And I think the NUMSA left wing inside COSATU, that kind of differentiation we see there, together with other smaller parties that are forming to the left of the ANC, and also including economic freedom fighters and possible other left socialist formations, that could be the beginning of a longer term realignment in politics that might, there's still a small chance, but that could be an embryonic form that what could eventually be an effective opposition to the ANC.
This is very interesting. We would love to get your thoughts as well. It's Interface on SABC3. That is on Facebook, at Tembisa Magele on Twitter. And also just wanting to find out after the break, are we likely then to have free and fair elections? Give us your thoughts. Well, we are now wrapping up our conversation with Aisha Kaji, who's an independent political analyst, and Professor Susan Boyson, who is with Wits University, and taking some of your Facebook messages coming in thick and fast. Denzel Harper says, the fact that South African people out there are objecting to the vote and are not willing to exercise it speaks of an ingrained and deep-seated dissatisfaction against the South African government. Reinhard Leopold says the election will not be free and fair. Intimidation and violence will be rife. Welcome Shade. He says people still need to be educated because not voting is not the solution. And Makwenkwe Tengwa says voting is a right we should protect and defend, yet people do not eat democracy. I thought that was an interesting comment.
And perhaps indicative of the very deep levels of frustration, like your first correspondent said, that, you know, people actually feel their voices are not being heard through the voting process. So they're looking for other avenues, sometimes legitimate other avenues, and sometimes legitimate protests turning to violent ones. But I think we also then need to look at how our government and our media reacts to those. How are we actually portraying the voices of those people who are so dissatisfied? Are they actually being heard? Is the SABC giving them a platform? Is the ANC government hearing them? These are the questions we need to be asking. When police actually break up a protest, are they aware of the right to peaceful protest? And is the manner in which the security forces responds an appropriate manner as well?
So these are the questions we should be looking at. But in terms of people saying that they're not going to vote and, you know, these threats coming up at every election, what should the politicians, not just the ruling party, but across the board, what should their response be to this? And how can they, you know, try and keep this from happening next time around so we don't see libraries going up in flames and clinics and all of those good things?
I think a deep, deep pledge, and apparently existing pledges are being good and responsive, accountable representatives have not really worked. Those elected representatives, if they could only take a convincing pledge, put themselves on the spot, which of course is difficult in a proportional representation system, but it is that guarantee of accountability and going to see their elected representatives regularly, and those people bringing substantive report backs to them on a regular basis. I think that would go a massive way in terms of making the elections what democratic elections are supposed to be about. Not confirmation about what has already happened at party political conferences of liberation movement at a point of 20 years of democracy, which is a massive boost, which is very bad news for opposition parties that have not been in power. They cannot have that claim and that big thrust, and that is still coming towards the end of April, about a week before the elections. All of these things will weigh in how free and fair the elections will be judged at the end of the day.
So there is that 20 years of democracy feel that's going to likely come through closer to the election. But there's also the Madiba factor. 30 years since Madiba walked out of prison. We've just laid him to rest last year. How is that likely to play in this space?
I'll be very brief. In many ways, I think the ANC had at first overestimated the Madiba factor in terms of their own condemnation of the people's condemnation of existing leadership. In contrast, the contrast between existing leadership and the Madiba type leadership was really accentuated in the process of Madiba's passing and the funerals. On the other hand, we also know from the research that voters are frequently prepared to look past the current incumbents and say a certain movement, a certain party is bigger than just the current people.
And your thoughts, Aisha?
I think that what Susan says is true. The incumbent party in this country is more than a political party in the minds of many people. It's a member of the family. If your child is recalcitrant, you don't disown that child until that child has disappointed you again and again and again. And that's the feeling many South Africans have towards the ruling party. However, their patience is wearing thin, and the warning is written clear and large. Deliver on promises, root out corruption, stop conspicuous consumption, or you're going to pay at the polls.
Are we likely, speaking of those polls, are we then likely to see free and fair elections, relatively free of violence and intimidation?
I think we are. I think we're still, have an independent enough electoral commission and other institutions of democracy that we will be able to run a free and fair election despite perhaps sporadic pockets of disturbance. However, again, a word of warning towards the security forces: beware of over-exerting the power that you have, because that is likely to enrage citizens. And it's something you don't want to do right now.
Do that. And your thoughts, Prof, particularly with reports that we're getting that the newcomer, the EFF, is somehow fueling the protests that we are seeing.
That is also a very convenient belief to put forward, argument to put forward by the existing authorities, because protests have indeed been there, as Mr. Julius Malema have also said, long before the EFF was there. We know in that month of May 2009, as President Jacob Zuma and his regime came into power, there were massive progress. Mr. Malema was the only person who could go into the communities and make peace there. But this is the month where we really have to watch out for the intimidation factor. We know in the past, when COPE came onto the scene in 2009, that period just before the election was proclaimed and just before the political parties officially became subject to their code of conduct, that was a wild time. Tables were flying around in venues. Venues were being occupied by opposing political parties. So if we can emerge from this current month of February with dignity and free and fair play, that will also say a lot about the forthcoming elections.
And we spoke earlier about the whole coalition thing and how it's a little bit late now in the game to try and do that. What should opposition parties be thinking of doing right now?
They should be rallying their supporters. They should be, all parties, including the incumbent and opposition, should be getting mechanisms in place, observers, party political observers, etc., monitors, and using technology to ensure that this is a free and fair election. And the IEC should also perhaps consider an extra registration day, given that some stations were marred by violence this last weekend.
Some very useful information that I need to give out at that very point. The voters' roll closes on the day that the president proclaims the election date. That hasn't happened yet. Proclamation is expected before the end of February. That means that if you did miss those registration days, you can go to your local IEC office and actually register to vote there. So that is good news for those who may have missed the registration period. And we would be interested to see how that will affect those numbers that we spoke about in the beginning. Ladies, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for coming through to talk to us. We have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. Do join us again next week at the same time. And as usual, let's keep the conversation going on our Facebook page, Interface on SABC3, or on my Twitter account at Thembisa Magele. Good night.